Welcome, everyone, and thank you for coming. This is a panel presentation called Models for Building Local Broadband, Public, Private, Co-op, and Nonprofit. And we have a really wonderful audience here in person and also a live audience from around the nation. First, I want to thank our hosts, the Urbana-Champaign Independent Media Center, as well as Urbana Public Television here at the City of Urbana, Illinois. So give a round of applause to everyone who made this happen today. This session will last 90 minutes, and it's being broadcast here on Channel 6, and I think that's Channel 99 on Uverse, and also live streamed at ustream.tv/channel/UCIMC. It'll be archived as well at the Urbana-Champaign Independent Media Center website, which is ucimc.org. And briefly, the topic is Models for Building Fiber-to-the-Home Broadband Networks. My name is Brandon Bowersox-Johnson. I'm a city council member here at the City of Urbana and serve on the policy board of our local broadband network called Urbana-Champaign Big Broadband, UC2B. And we have an amazing group of panelists who are experts in this field. I'm going to briefly welcome them in the order that they'll speak later. So first we have Chris Mitchell. Chris works at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, where he's the director of the Telecommunications as Commons initiative, and he really, for years, has been one of the leading voices writing articles and covering community broadband around the country. You can follow his coverage at their website, ilsr.org. That's ilsr.org. And if you click on broadband, you can find reports, articles, follow the Twitter feed, or sign up for a weekly email update that has really key news about community broadband. So Chris, welcome and thanks for being with us today. Confirm.
Thank you.
Yeah, good. I'm glad we can confirm we can hear you. Next, we have Joanne Hovis, who could be here in person. Thank you so much for, I know your trip wasn't just for this reason, but for offering to visit us here in person. Joanne is the president of CTC Technology and Energy, where she advises public and not-for-profit clients on building community broadband networks, and especially on the changing landscape of how communities provide communication services to the public. Joanne serves as president of NATOA. You might have heard of NATOA, the National Association of Telecommunications Officers and Advisors, and she's consulted really for many, many distinguished organizations and is a leading advocate helping communities provide telecommunications in the public interest. Joanne has also worked on the UC2B project from the early days when it was just an idea on paper to most recently helping really define the core values and the public policy ways to achieve those values. So welcome, Joanne. I'm so glad you could be here and join us.
Thank you, Brandon.
We also have Wally Bowen. Wally is the founder and executive director of the not-for-profit Mountain Area Information Network, which is in Asheville, North Carolina. And Wally has the experience of operating a successful ISP and has been an early advocate for locally owned middle-mile fiber networks and local ownership of media infrastructure in general. He has encouraged the use of co-op models that started in the early days of kind of rural electrification. And when the Recovery Act funding came about, he wrote a paper called the Local Network Cookbook and really promoted this model. He's spoken at the Aspen Institute and many of the leading media reform conferences, and we're really delighted, Wally, that you could join us.
Good to be here. Thanks.
Thank you. And last we have Greta Byram, who is a senior field analyst with the Open Technology Institute at the New America Foundation, where she provides research and evaluation on the community impact of telecommunications policy and regulation. If you've never heard of the OTI and the New America Foundation, they're a really critical agency that formulates policy to support open architectures, open source, open communications, and their July 2012 report entitled The Cost of Connectivity shows once again that Americans are paying more and getting slower speeds for broadband than many other places in the world. Their April 2012 report, which Greta was a co-author of, is called Universities as Hubs for Next Generation Networks, and it proposes an organic or decentralized model for growing networks and for organizing the community. So Greta, we're so glad that you could be with us. Thank you.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
We today are going to really focus the brain power of this crew of experts on the different models for local communities building broadband, how they can build it, fund it, and operate it. And I have to say, none of these models are easy. If it were easy, many communities would already have done this. Many communities would be building gigabit fiber to the home networks. But in America, because of our regulation and where we are as a country, we simply don't have the same kind of networks and structure as many other countries and places. And so we'll hear a lot about these models, and all of them have challenges or difficulties that if we want to pursue them as a community, we'll need to overcome. So I really hope you'll listen to all these models, to their differences, and to how our community could take advantage of these lessons. After the panel discussion today, we'll have a lot of time for questions. We'll have questions here from the audience in person in Urbana, Illinois. We'll also have chat questions that people who are watching the live stream can submit. And to do that, you can log into the Ustream website, ustream.tv, where the live stream is currently being broadcast. If you log in, you can use the chat function next to the video to send us questions, which we'll compile. I want to briefly just give a little background for this conversation. We're here in Urbana, Illinois, where we are completing a publicly owned municipal fiber optic broadband system called Urbana-Champaign Big Broadband, UC2B. And that has built a backbone around the community that connects schools, health providers, fire stations, and it also connects to individual homes in neighborhoods that amount to roughly 10% of the community. So people in individual homes in those neighborhoods can sign up and get a fiber optic line built directly to their house to get a kind of broadband of speed and quality and two-directional communication that is just not possible without that kind of fiber optic technology. The project was made possible by federal and state funds and is just finishing now to connect those 10% of neighborhoods. And so the huge question on the minds of us here in this local community is how do we build to the other 90%, to those other neighborhoods of our town that UC2B has not already built residential connections in? With what funds? Who will control it? How will we make sure that we bridge the digital divide and support digital inclusion for minorities or low-income users? There's many questions. So in the forum today, we're going to hear from these experts about some different models, and I encourage you to really think about the pros and the cons and differences and how we can make them work or pick a model that works for our community here. But this is also not just a local conversation. This is really a national conversation because all over the U.S., communities find that they're lagging behind other places in the world where there are fiber-to-the-home, ultra-fast broadband systems that are available. And it's expensive to build, so it's not the easiest thing to just do overnight. There are even large telecom companies here in our country who have begun building fiber-to-the-home networks, like the Verizon Fios network, or the AT&T U-verse network is a kind of fiber-to-the-neighborhood model. And they've both found that it's hard to pay for an expensive system like fiber optics to the home. And both of those telecom companies are not building out further to other neighborhoods and places. So many cities in America find themselves really wondering, how can we find a model to get us the world's best internet like so many places overseas have? You may have heard of some of the cities, and you'll hear of them today, like Chattanooga, that has a municipal network that offers gigabit fiber to the home service, or Kansas City, where Google Fiber has chosen to build a fiber to the home network in a public-private partnership model. And in fact, 1,100 cities all over the country applied to be part of that Google Fiber program because community leaders everywhere want the world's best broadband for their community, for jobs and education, healthcare, and the economy. So with 10% of the neighborhoods covered in this town, we really seek the model that can fill out the other 90% of our community. This community applied to be part of a public-private partnership with a company called Gigabit Squared that would build out a network here. And we've also conducted an RFI seeking other private partners that would include private companies or co-op models, and our staff are exploring municipal models. So all of the models we'll hear about today are things that are being discussed locally but also nationally. The local conversation will continue in the weeks and months ahead. People who are interested in the local issue could tune in this coming Monday night at 7 p.m. The Urbana City Council will have a presentation of some of the latest findings about the different models by our staff. So with that, I'd like to start the conversation from our expert panelists today. And our first panelist, Christopher Mitchell, again from the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, knows a lot about the municipal model all over the country. And again, the municipal model meaning your municipality would build these fiber optic lines down the street and build and own and operate some of this infrastructure. So Chris, I would like to hand the floor over to you as you really tell us what are these municipal networks, where are they, how do they work, how are they paid for and operated, and give us a look at municipal broadband in the United States.
Great. You're breaking up a little bit, so I'm just going to hope that you can hear me fine.
We can hear you loud and clear.
With interference, I think, from the group call. But basically, you had asked a series of questions, and I'll go through them over the next few minutes. In short, municipal networks are scattered throughout the United States. I was going to try and share my screen, but it actually isn't working out as well as I'd hoped. It's too small of an image. But if your techs there have a TriCaster and can throw up somehow the URL from muninetworks.org/community map, you'll see charted a whole bunch of community wired networks. We don't have all the community networks on there, but we have a whole heck of a lot of them, and we're always trying to add on to it. So if anyone knows of any that aren't listed, please let us know. We chart something like 70 cities that have fiber to the home that's universal throughout the city. About that same number of cities, again, have cable networks. Some of those cable networks are being upgraded to a fiber to the home product as well. So about 150, 140, somewhere in there is what we have in terms of citywide systems that are owned by the local government. And then our best estimate for other sorts of investments it's in the order of hundreds in terms of local governments that operate some form of telecommunications network that may be connecting just one business park or a downtown business district. But there's a lot of investments that communities have made in different ways, and they're not all very well aggregated. There's no central source yet that explains what they've all done. That's something that we're working on. In terms of the success rate of these networks, it helps to define what we're talking about in terms of success. Most of the networks were built to encourage economic development, and most of these networks have stories about how either new jobs have come to town or existing employers have expanded, done very well, they've improved quality of life. In many cases, they have lowered prices from incumbents, creating millions of dollars in aggregate savings. They've given people a real choice. They provided universal service, making sure that every last person has a connection. And some of these are among the top networks in the nation. And so, depending on how you want to measure success, I would say these have been overwhelmingly successful. But most of these networks are evaluated more critically on a private model, which is to say, if a private entity owned that network, would it be considered a success? Is it generating positive income for the community? And in that area, most of the networks are still young enough that that we can't say that they are absolutely a success using that metric, because they have a lot of debt to pay off. And many of them, I'd say the majority of them, are on their way to paying off that debt within the anticipated time that they thought they would. Some are doing far better, and like Cedar Falls in Iowa, they were so far ahead of their schedule on a cable network that they decided to upgrade to fiber to the home. Chattanooga was supposed to have a loss of $4 million this year because they're only in year 3 of their build, but they, I believe, were $6 million or $8 million, some large number in the black. Wilson, North Carolina, just turned the corner. They have operating cost benefits. They are operating in the positive, and they are able to pay their debt. So by that measure, we also have a lot of success stories. However, it gets more difficult because you're not really accounting for these networks in a way that would be appropriate for a public investment, I think. So my answer is that we have an overwhelming number of successes, and we need to pay attention to those that haven't succeeded to learn lessons from them. Those that have struggled, and indeed we have a few that we would probably call failures, it's mostly because they didn't generate enough revenue. Many of these networks did succeed in providing additional choices, lowering prices, and creating universal service, but they didn't get enough customers, which means they sort of got behind. And when you get behind over a period of years, it can be very difficult to ever break even. And so by that metric, we have a number that have failed. The reason for that overwhelmingly tends to be marketing. They did not do a good enough job of responding to the incumbent attacks. And in some cases, actually, they struggle because they are going against a competitor that has lowered the price below the cost of providing the service. And so in Monticello, Minnesota, a provider was offering a product that was clearly they were losing money on it. And so that has hurt the municipal network greatly. So there are some cases in which we see municipal networks, we might say that they're unfairly having to deal with the market, because no one should be able to offer their services below cost over a long period of time. In terms of how these networks are financed, it's almost always by revenue bonds. Sometimes it's backed by taxpayer dollars, and sometimes it's not. The vast majority of times it's actually backed by utility assets, because the vast majority of cities that have built these networks have done it through a publicly owned electric utility. Some 2,000 cities across the U.S. have their own electrical utility, and of them, a number have made these investments. So it's not something that's probably available to some of the cities in Illinois that I'm guessing is an overwhelming number of people in the audience are interested in that sort of situation. But we are also seeing a different model arise, and that is the model in which the network is built out of the CIO office. Local government, city and counties are doing this sort of approach. Often it's more of an incremental approach as opposed to a bond and build everywhere at once kind of approach. So that's something that we're seeing that's somewhat new. Examples of that are Santa Monica, which I'm working on a case study right now to explain, and Martin County is another one that we just completed a case study of. So for people who are interested in learning more about that, you can certainly check out ilsr.org, as Brandon noted. It has a lot of our reports and other resources, but actually the place I would recommend people go for more information specifically about local governments is a site that we created that just focuses on these community networks. That's muninetworks.org. And we post almost every day, and we try to make it very easy for people to follow our content there. So I look forward to joining in on the future rounds of questions and hearing what my excellent panelists have to say in their introductory comments. So thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Chris Mitchell. And we did get that map up on the screen of those hundreds of community broadband networks around the country that you all track. So thank you. Next, I want to turn the floor to Joanne Hovis to really talk about these public-private models, whether it's the gigabit squared type project or the Google Fiber type project, ways that local communities can partner with private companies and together fulfill some of these things. So where are these things happening? What do they look like? How are they governed, and how do they operate?
Thanks, Brandon. It's a real pleasure to be here. The public-private partnership is a really broad category, because even in an environment where most of the ownership or all of the ownership is municipal or county, there are going to be lots of private partners who are helping to build the network, operate the network, maintain, and so on. So there are private entities who are part of every single municipal project, and that's really important to note, that the private sector is benefited by municipal networks all the time, even when we call them municipal. But looking specifically at public-private partnerships, they are frequently, I think, a way to share a range of different risks and benefits that benefits both the private sector partner, that may be looking at the rather formidable challenge of funding an infrastructure build-out that is incredibly costly in a very difficult market that's a natural monopoly, and is looking for ways to lower costs, but is also looking for a partner to share those upfront costs. And in the case of the municipality or county, it's a way of also sharing those costs, sharing the risk, rather than taking on the entirety of that risk, as many of the communities that Chris just described have done. And where we are in terms of seeing the emergence of public-private partnerships, I would say, is in relatively early stages. The dynamic of the municipal hybrid fiber coax and fiber-to-the-home networks that Chris described is one that's about 15 years old. That 80 or so municipal networks out there have been emerging over the past 15 years, and that accelerated really in the late 90s and the beginning of the century. But the public-private partnership is a new and emerging model. And so we are at the forefront, I think, at the beginning of something that's going to be very interesting, very challenging, but where we have not a whole lot of models, or we have some very preliminary models and limited data, particularly with respect to fiber to the home or fiber to the business, fiber to the premises. Or this is relatively new stuff. So let me suggest that as a community or communities like these look at what their range of options is for building fiber to every home and business in a community, there are a couple of ways to think about what a public-private partnership might look like, or if that might not be the right model. Maybe one of the other models that's being addressed today is better. And there are a few different ways of thinking about that. I would say the prime framing items to think about are risk, reward, and control. And it won't come as any surprise that there are trade-offs among these things, that accomplishing all three of those is extremely challenging. Reward and control can be acquired relatively easily so long as one is willing to take on all the risk. But give up some of the risk and most likely one loses some of the control, certainly, but maybe not all of the reward. And I think in that regard, that really relates to what Chris was saying about how we think about, how we measure these projects, what our metrics are. Because if our metric is on the financial statements only and counted in how much we see in revenue to offset expenses, that's one set of metrics, and that may be very challenging to get to a positive reward. But if our metrics are based on things like enabling economic development, enabling education, allowing students to communicate with their teachers, parents to communicate with teachers, allowing new kinds of telehealth applications, and all of the other things that drive community fiber build-outs, because frankly, that's what drives them. It's not the financial metrics that tend to give rise to these projects. If those are the ways that we count rewards, then we might go through a very different kind of analysis than if rewards are measured only on the financial statements. So what might that look like as you go through this process? Well, you figure out what the goals are, figure out what the rewards and the tolerance for risk and the need for control are, and that points to certain kinds of models. So let me give you a few examples, and I also want to answer Brandon's question, and I hope you'll kick me under the table if I'm going over my 7 minutes. I'll talk fast.
3 minutes left.
3 minutes, okay. A few examples of how I think communities, some of which I'll name, some I won't, have entered into public-private partnerships that balance out risk, reward, and control to meet the needs of their communities, which are unique and singular because every community is different, and that's why local decision-making is so important. And at the same time meet their policy goals, but allow them to really share in risk, reward, and control in ways that are tolerable in that community, or maybe even desirable in that community. And these are different kinds of public-private partnerships. It's really fast. The community of Sandy, Oregon, which you can find online, announced yesterday a partnership with a private sector provider who is going to finance and build fiber to the home and the business throughout that community. They will also maintain it, which is an ongoing operating cost of no small significance in a fiber-to-the-premises network. And in return, the community will guarantee them a certain level of revenues for 10 years. And the community is going to be the ISP, is going to actually provide services, and is hoping it will be able to bring in that level of revenue in any event. But if they are not able to sell that amount of services, they will still have to give the guaranteed revenues to the private provider. In this way, the private provider has a guaranteed revenue stream for 10 years, and the community does not have to come up with the upfront cash to build the network, but is still the ISP, and still has control over the things that it presumably really cares about, which is the kinds of data products they're offering, the kinds of bandwidth that they're offering, and what the pricing is. So they've shared the risk, they've shared the financial rewards, but they've maintained control over the things that mattered most to them. And I don't mean to speak on their behalf, I'm projecting. I'm assuming that these are their considerations, but that's a really elegant solution if that's the way one approaches it. Here's another model, completely different. The city of Amsterdam entered into a public-private partnership a number of years ago with a local bank and with the housing cooperatives that own most of the residential real estate in Amsterdam, where the city funded a percentage of a fiber build in partnership with those entities. Did not fund the entirety. So it gave up a certain amount of control, certainly gave up a lot of reward down the road, assuming the network makes money. But the city was able to secure the two things that really matter to it, which were universal build-out, so that everybody would be built to. It wouldn't only be the wealthy neighborhoods, and open access. And those were their two key parameters. And so long as those two things were met, it did not matter to the city whether it owned the fiber or not. And they built into the structure for the network a model where fiber ownership was that set of entities, and then there was operations by another entity, and then service provision by another set of entities, thereby guaranteeing their policy outcomes, but limiting their risk. I know Brandon's about to tell me.
In 30 seconds.
30 seconds. Okay, really quickly. The Google model is a little bit different. It's a public-private partnership, but it's one in which Google will own, operate, and control its network. Kansas City has less control in that regard, but Kansas City also has close to no risk. It is in some ways providing some benefits to bring down the costs to Google to make it a very desirable network, but it's getting a massive, massive infusion of economic development funds, not just in the form of this network that is being built there. It's costing probably up to about $2 billion, which is a huge investment in any community, but also in all the long-term economic development benefits, these massive ancillary, fundamentally central, we call them ancillary, but they're not really, they're central benefits that are coming to Google. One last example of a public-private partnership that may or may not be of interest, and I can't name the community because we're in negotiations right now, but this is a community that has unserved areas where there is no product for many of its citizens to get a broadband product, and for people who want their children to have access to educational resources, and for people who want to run home-based businesses, this is a huge problem. The community has put up money and is in negotiations with a private provider where the community will fund 50% of the network build-out. The community doesn't care about owning the network, doesn't want to operate the network, doesn't want to place any restrictions on the network. They just want broadband out there. And their take on it is that the subsidy amount that they have to give is relatively modest compared to the economic development benefit of enabling a large number of people to run home-based businesses. And that's the reward from their standpoint. It's a completely different metric and a different form of control. So I'm going to stop there, although I could go on for a long time. Thank you for your patience.
No, it's great to see that there are many different ways to balance the risk, reward, and control sort of equation in community's own interest. So thank you. Next, I want to turn to the co-op and nonprofit models and hear from Wally Bowen again, who has founded the Mountain Area Information Network, which is a non-for-profit that is sort of based on the co-op model back to the early rural electrification days. And so, Wally, welcome again, and I want you to tell us how these networks work and where are they, how are they funded or operated and governed?
Okay, I hope you all can hear me. I'm having a little trouble with the audio. Jason, can you give me a cue that my audio is coming through okay?
We hear you fine in the room here, Wally, so please proceed.
Okay, excellent. Okay, we are a nonprofit. We're not a co-op in the strict sense of that word. Mountain Area Information Network began in 1996 when many of the rural counties here in the mountains of North Carolina had to call long distance to connect to the internet. So we were a dial-up provider for many years. In fact, we still have a few hundred dial-up subscribers today. But we found that in 1996-97, that one of the big challenges for us was affordable bandwidth. And so we began pushing for middle mile fiber infrastructure through a nonprofit business model that was locally owned and locally accountable, in which the investments remained in the community. Coincidentally, I assume folks may have some idea of where we're located in the mountain region of North Carolina, in the far western end of the state of North Carolina. And the big population center is Asheville. And Asheville is the home to the National Climatic Data Center. So this is the federal agency that collects climate data, not only from all across the U.S., but all across the world. And we were at risk of losing this facility to Baltimore or Boulder because we lacked broadband infrastructure. And that galvanized some of our leaders, and through a $15 million federal appropriation, we were able to build a nonprofit fiber network centered in Asheville, based on the model that we have been advocating for a couple of years. I say we, Mountain Area Information Network, plus the hospitals in Western North Carolina. We seem to be the two anchor agencies that really were sensitive to the cost, the high cost of bandwidth. At that time, we were paying wholesale $2,500 a month for a T1 line, which is 1.5 megabits per second. So that's how we got started with the first nonprofit fiber network, which today is called ERC Broadband. And it is a middle mile provider that is only available to anchor institutions like schools and colleges, or to providers like us. Out of that model, that only served about 4 counties in the heart of the mountains, but it was a template for other regions of the mountains to build nonprofit fiber networks. And so today we have Balsam West, which is to the west of Asheville, about 8 counties, and it's a public-private partnership between the eastern band of the Cherokee and a private software firm that's located in Franklin, North Carolina. But it operates as a nonprofit, even though it's an LLC. Now, to the north and the south of Asheville, we have a nonprofit called Pangea that serves several of the counties to the south. And to the north, we have a traditional rural electric cooperative, which through able to direct their way through the Rural Internet Access Authority, has built out middle mile fiber that has helped our network serve last mile homes and businesses. Now, I'm envious of everyone who's spoken so far talking about fiber to individual homes and businesses. but in our rural mountainous area where there's really low population density and very rugged terrain, fiber to the home or to the business is, no pun intended, but a pipe dream at this time. So our goal has been to push the middle mile fiber as deep as we can into these rural areas, and then use wireless for the last mile piece. And that has only been a partial solution because last mile wireless technology isn't quite there yet. It's not a matter of the technology, it's a matter of policy. For example, November 2008, we won a very critical victory at the Federal Communications Commission to make available unused TV channels called the TV white spaces for unlicensed wireless broadband use in rural areas. And because of a variety of, mostly bureaucratic and resistance from the broadcast industry, that technology is still not quite to market. And so where we are right now is trying to push the FCC to accelerate and actually incentivize the bringing this new wireless technology to market. The reason this is important is that this technology, wireless broadband technology using the TV spectrum, will actually penetrate heavy foliage. We have a lot of trees here in North Carolina. It will bend around mountain ridges, and it will travel great distances, 25, 30 miles, and it has a high carrying capacity, 15 to 20 megabits per second, up to 25 megabits per second, and perhaps technology develops. But it's not been a big push in Washington to help the manufacturers get this technology to market. And so I do have a slide, Jason, if you could throw up the first slide, to kind of illustrate some of these, the networks I'm talking about. I'm not sure if I'll be able to see it on the screen here.
Wally, we did. We see the slide that's kind of color-coded with the regions there in the mountains and around Asheville. And here in the last minute, I hope you can especially speak to the governance of these co-op networks and how are they governed?
I'm sorry, I can't really hear what you're saying.
Go right ahead then.
So are those slides visible?
Yes.
So the first slide, you'll see the colorful areas of this is the mountain region of North Carolina. The red center in the middle is where this first middle mile fiber network, ERC Broadband, took shape. The green to the left of the screen is Balsam West, the public-private partnership between the Eastern Band of the Cherokee and a private software firm. The blue north is the Rural Electric Cooperative, and the yellow to the south is Pangea, another 501c3 nonprofit. The color areas to the north and northeast are rural telephone companies that have moved into broadband very quickly. So the next slide makes the distinction between the middle mile and last mile layers, infrastructure layers that I've been describing. And then the next slide actually shows some of the fiber routes for the first nonprofit fiber network, ERC Broadband. The next slide shows the fiber routes for Balsam West, the far western counties. The next slide shows the fiber routes for Pangea. And we estimate we don't have exact figures, but somewhere between 800 and 1,000 miles of nonprofit fiber that's already operational in the mountain region of North Carolina. The next slide shows the 4 counties that my network, Last Mile Wireless Network, serves. And you actually see the color map of our coverage. The bright yellow areas are the areas most likely to get our signal. And you can see there's a lot of area where the signal is not sufficient for people to get a Wi-Fi broadband connection with the current technology we have. So that's why we are so anxious about getting access to this new broadband technology through the new spectrum of the TV white spaces.
Okay, wonderful.
It is actually a report from the Aspen Institute that came out in March of 2010. And the title of it speaks to what we're attempting to do in our very rural, challenging region, again, with low population density. And that is to create a fiber-intensive wireless architecture. And finally, the last slide addresses the issue of how do we pay for this? How do we finance it? And it may not be that well known to many people that the FCC now has a program called Connect America that is allocating $4.5 billion a year through 2020 to finance broadband infrastructure build out in rural and other underserved areas. The catch is that only the incumbent carriers, who mostly don't want to serve these areas, are eligible for this funding. And that's a policy challenge that we have to really step up to and change. And we just had an opening for challenging this policy because the Connect America Fund was launched earlier this year when the FCC offered about $300 million in incentives for companies to build out into rural areas. Only $85 million of this funding was accepted. AT&T and Verizon and most of the big carriers turned it down. It's pretty well known that they're not interested in serving rural areas. They're trying to opt out through some deregulation for serving these areas. And it's a huge policy disconnect that the rural electric cooperatives, the nonprofits, the municipal networks that Chris and Joanne have been describing, all of us who've been working in this space all these years are not eligible for this funding. And we think it's a terrific opportunity to turn up the heat on the FCC and on Congress to change what is clearly a program, the Connect America program, that's not working. And so, and as I said earlier, turning up the heat on the FCC to devote some of this funding to get the TV white spaces technology to market.
Okay, thank you, Wally. For time, I'm gonna interrupt you there, but I know we can come back with audience questions to many more of those topics. We really appreciate hearing your perspective there, and even some of the networks around you that have a variety of these interesting co-op and nonprofit models. And so last, I want to turn to Greta Byram from the Open Technology Institute at the New America Foundation, who, as I'd said before, was co-author of the paper called Universities as Hubs for Next Generation Networks. And Greta really proposes an organic or decentralized model for growing networks and for organizing communities. So Greta, welcome, and I know we have your slides as well, so hopefully we'll be able to both hear and see your presentation.
Great. Hi, can you hear me?
Absolutely, we can hear you just fine, Greta.
Great. So I'll try to go pretty quickly here and to try to sum up a little bit of what's been said because I think everybody's made really great points. And I really like Joanne's framework of risk, reward, and control. And I think that everything I'm going to talk about today can really fit nicely into that framework. So we have come at the BTOP project from the other side. That is, whereas you guys in Urbana-Champaign had an infrastructure grant, we have actually been partners on Public Computer Center and Sustainable Broadband Adoption grants. And so, and we didn't get any funding for infrastructure grants. So what we've done is pretty much like try to supplement the PCC and SBA work that we're doing with sort of DIY build outs. And those have mostly been mesh wireless build outs. But what we found is that it's really important to think about some of the issues around adoption and workforce development alongside the build out. And we've had a lot of success doing that, especially in Detroit. What you see on my first slide is it's an image of a Lego model of a neighborhood in Detroit that we actually built together with some community members so they could sort of imagine where they would want to start placing nodes in their community to start building out a wireless network. So that's pretty typical of the approach that we take. We try to make what we do sort of playful. We try to engage people and really get their input in whatever we're designing. My second slide, you could go, if you can advance to that. This is an example.
And we don't yet, Greta, see your slides up, but we will, hopefully we'll get them here on the screen. So until then, describe a little bit about some of these great illustrations you have.
Okay. The next slide, I can just tell you about it. A lot of the way that we approach, the next slide, I can just tell you about it. Sorry, one second. A lot of the way that we approach, the next slide, I can sorry about it. Sorry, a lot of the way that we approach, the next slide, I can sorry,
Greta,
I'm having bad feedback here.
Yeah, sorry, we just had.
Bad feedback here.
Yeah, sorry, we just.
Hello?
We'll let our tech folks test the audio here, and we may need to reconnect with you, Greta. So thanks for everyone's patience.
Can you guys hear me now?
We can hear you now.
Okay, wow, that was really disturbing. But anyway, the next thing I wanted to talk about a little bit was a project that a number of people at OTA were involved in a few years ago, which was Philadelphia's attempt to build a wireless network. And they made a lot of choices, I think, based on sort of Joanne's rubric of risk-reward control, in which they really tried to offset the risk completely by making a contract with Earthlink to do all the build out, and in return for doing all the build out, Earthlink received ownership and also took on the maintenance tasks for the network. But what that meant was also that the city was not getting revenue for the network, and therefore lost a lot of the reward in addition to the control. And what ended up happening was that Earthlink took on a lot of public interest obligations, including some digital literacy obligations. So they were sort of trapped in this position of getting a lot of pressure from the incumbents on one side, and then meanwhile having to invest in a lot of expensive digital literacy efforts, and meanwhile they were not actually getting enough subscribers for the network, particularly in under-resourced communities, which is where there's often a problem with low subscribership and low adoption rates. And so that project failed. The wireless network in Philadelphia, Wireless Philadelphia, went under, I believe, in 2006 or 2007. However, I think that there's some really good lessons to be taken from that. One of them being, maybe there's a better balance of risk-reward control that can be, striven for, and that can take lots of different shapes, including, some blend of private and public ownership, as Joanne was suggesting. But what we would emphasize is that it's always really important for the decision-making process to be transparent, for the community to be involved in the decision-making, and for that to happen on an ongoing basis. That's something that didn't happen in Philadelphia at all. People felt that they gave input into the process, and then their input was pretty much disregarded or set aside. So I don't know if you guys can see my slides at all. The next slide I was going to show was a picture of one of the games that we play with communities, again, to get people's input. It's kind of difficult describing to people in a community, how you build a wireless network is pretty abstract and complex. And so we try to make it as concrete as possible, like I said before, with the Lego model or this game that we play, which is called Every Network Tells a Story. And the idea behind the game is that people start to think about the characters in their neighborhood, about the social patterns and the social relationships, and they use that as a way to sort of dive into thinking about where the infrastructure would go, where the routers would go, sort of how to plan the network all together. So the last slide that I wanted to show is the diagram that comes from the paper that Jason mentioned, Universities as Hubs for Next Generation Networks, in which we talked about the way to leverage a fiber ring, which is obviously an asset that Urbana-Champaign has, and to use that fiber ring to build out wireless mesh infrastructure into the community by building partnerships not only with providers, ISPs, but also partnerships with universities, with schools, with any group that's interested in running a training program. People can learn about wireless technology by putting up routers on the rooftops in their neighborhoods. So the idea is to combine the workforce development, the adoption together with the build out process. So in closing, I'll just say that there's sort of a prevailing kind of approach, which I would characterize as like, if you build it, they will come. And I think that's not necessarily such a great strategy, as we've seen in some cases, especially in Philadelphia. You can build a network, but if you don't work on adoption and digital literacy, you're not going to have a lot of buy-in especially from under-resourced communities. And then you're not going to get the revenues that you need to offset the capital expenses of the build-out. So we would recommend in general that it's a good idea to start with wireless at least, and to use that as a basis for planning later fiber to the premises build out.
Okay, thank you very much, Greta. And it's been really marvelous to hear some of these different examples, stories, and models. And we have left the whole last 30 minutes here for Q&A, really driven by both the audience here in the room and our online audience, who can submit questions at the chat box on the right side of the Ustream. So we're combining those questions, and we'll also allow the audience in the room to ask questions. During the question time, we'll be very brief. I don't want people to give speeches. We want everybody to really have a chance to ask a question and let these experts tell us stories, examples, and lessons learned from other places around the country. So with that, I'm looking at Christina, who's helping us compile some of these questions. Do we have a number of questions online that you could start to go through?
I think everybody was just so astounded with the wisdom of all of our wonderful speakers today that we are waiting with bated breath for our live audience members here.
What we'll do is we'll let live audience members here ask questions, and you can kind of queue up in the aisle, and we'll take one at a time. And if online questions come, Christina will flag us so that we can alternate and give everyone a fair chance. So welcome.
Hi, Danielle Shenowitz. I have two. Actually, I have 100 questions. I'll stick to two. The first question is with a co-op, and this is for, I think that all of our speakers are kind of knowledgeable across this, so it's not specific to anyone. How can we guarantee a full build out and not just connect the wealthy with the co-op? And the second question, I think, is for Joanne, but others might pipe in. I was a cable commissioner, and we had certain protections in terms of our local authority that were stripped over time by federal changes, federal and state changes. So when I think of a public-private partnership where there's certain contractual obligations of the private partner that look a lot like those old kind of cable provisions for someone to come in as a monopoly, how do we ensure that that local authority and those provisions won't be stripped in the future? Is there some, could we be sued? Are the feds moving in to make changes such that we wouldn't be able to control our infrastructure, even though it looks like on the surface with the contract we can? So those are my two questions. Co-op, how do we guarantee full build out, not just connect the wealthy? And if we do a public-private partnership, how do we protect our interests in the long term?
Yep. And we're going to take those questions one at a time, so I make sure that everybody on the line, all our panelists, get a chance to speak to them. So that to that first question of, with co-ops, how do we ensure access to all neighborhoods, not just wealthy neighborhoods? Would any of our panelists like to jump in?
Yeah, this is Wally. Well, first of all, if you are a co-op, you're set up as some form of nonprofit, you have bylaws, so you hardwire those goals into your bylaws and your mission statement. There's another question, though, about governance of a co-op, and there are a wide range of governance models. I have seen co-ops that operate on consensus, and a handful of people can block movement if the group can't achieve consensus. Other co-ops operate more like a standard nonprofit with a board of directors that's elected by the membership. So there's a wide variation there, but again, making sure the bylaws clearly define the goals of the organization is the key.
Christopher or Greta, any additional comments on that question?
I would just add, the problem, poor communities getting left behind is not. It's not only a problem that is encountered by co-op models. And I just wanted to point to an article that came out, I believe, last week in Wired about how the Google Fiber project is actually splitting along Kansas City's digital divide. So it's actually reinforcing and worsening the digital divide in Kansas based on the way that they planned the build out there, which was basically to build out to the areas where they got subscribership.
Definitely. Any other final thoughts on that one? Joanne? Yeah.
I agree with Greta that the issue of serving the entire community in universal service is not unique to a co-op model. It is intrinsic in any model, because the reality of things is that some areas are going to result in less financial return, and again, that's thinking about the returns as measured on the financial statements, than other areas. And that is the reason why the private sector frequently is not building in certain areas, and why the private sector has gone to a lot of trouble to make sure that it had the right under state and federal law to not have to build everywhere. And in the cable example, I think, is a good example of that. The way we've traditionally dealt with that issue in the United States is that in the phone context, we've had a universal service fund that we all fund, and that allows for construction and operation of phone lines to places that are not economically viable for phone service or don't result in some kind of a return. And the Connect America Fund is attempting to do the same thing in broadband, but has fallen short in a number of ways, and Wally touched on that, I thought, very well. And in the cable context, the way we dealt with it is that local governments, through the cable franchising process, required the cable company to build out universally to a community up to a certain level of density. This is a fundamental intrinsic problem. And I would suggest that there are just going to be certain neighborhoods where there will have to be certain kinds of additional support. It may be digital literacy support, it may be local funding, it may be, as here in the UC2B scenario, there was the prescience to ask for a federal grant to serve exactly those neighborhoods that are likely to be least attractive to the private sector in terms of long-term revenues. That's the challenge, but part of that is measuring your benefits beyond what's on the financial statements and saying this is worth the investment from a community standpoint.
Mm-hmm. And the second audience question was, Joanne Hovis, specifically to you, about from the perspective of a cable commissioner who had gone through federal authority trumping local decision-making, how do we ensure that the kind of private parties maintain the public interest decisions and policies that we hope to put in place in these networks? So a lot of what happened in the cable context is that local regulatory authority was either removed, reduced, or changed through state legislation. And to the extent you can influence your state legislature to understand what you're doing and why it matters, that's obviously going to help. That's a tall order. I will say that you have a tremendous governor here in Illinois, and that's not true everywhere, but you have a governor who really understands broadband and has for a long time and cares about it and puts the state's money where his mouth is, and that's to his credit. I don't know how we avoid what comes with regulatory change, but I would think that through a contracting process that is not in a regulated environment, and broadband is not regulated, that if you go through a contracting process with a private sector provider, you will have all the protections of contract law. And I suppose that there are still mechanisms by which legal change can interfere with that, but the difference between the cable environment and the current broadband environment, and I'm not even sure these terms make sense, but it is the language that's used in terms of the regulatory framework, is that here you wouldn't be under a regulatory structure. It would be just contract law. In cable, it was a contract with a cable provider, but under a certain form of regulatory authority that you then lost. So negotiate hard with a private provider if that's the model that you end up with. Okay, thank you very much. I saw another audience question here in the room. Feel free to come on up and briefly ask your question.
Community representative for UC2B, Reverend Bogan. Joanne, you spoke about rewards, intellectual and financial. You spoke about control and those things that may be losing or may be gaining. But we've spoken very little about risk. What are the risks versus the co-op, versus a third-party operation, versus someone who is actually owning the infrastructure?
And that's a great question. I'll actually let Joanne answer first, and I'm sure all the panelists will have something to say about that risk part of the equation. Joanne?
Every community is going to define risk differently. For some communities, they're going to have there will be no tolerance for financial risk at all. So if the community has some financial stake in the network, they will need to have really strong assurances that they will be able to make that money back, or that the network will pay for itself over time and service its own debt and so on. That's financial risk. There is risk of not being able to achieve your policy goals. So you can reduce risk on the financial side by perhaps partnering, assuming there's a private partner who's interested. You can reduce that risk, but risk losing the outcome that you are really looking for around open access or competition or certain kinds of pricing or universal build out. Those are risks also, and those things are trade-offs, inevitably. And then finally, I'd say there's another risk that's really important to take into account, which is, what is the broader risk of not acting at all? What is the broader risk of not having fiber to the premises in a community? Unfortunately, I think that as a nation, we are taking that risk. We are experimenting with that rather large risk. And those communities who are investing or partnering or finding mechanisms to get fiber to the premises in their communities are taking certain kinds of risks, but they're alleviating the risk of being the place where the network does not go and where the innovation will not happen and where the jobs will not flow and where the children will not have certain resources for education. And that's a particularly important risk to take into account as well.
And to our other panelists, Christopher, Wally, and Greta, that same question, in the models you spoke about, what can go wrong? What are the risks?
I'll jump in first. Well, the risk with the municipal ownership is primarily that taxpayers will be on the hook, or that if they use a financing mechanism in which taxpayers could not be on the hook, that one might damage one's credit rating by walking away from a debt or such a outcome. I would like to just say that there's a risk also of every other approach. The co-op model, I think there's a real risk of it not being funded. Creating a new co-op is incredibly difficult. Expanding an existing co-op seems to work fairly well, but where we've seen people try to build a brand new co-op just to do broadband, well, quite frankly, we haven't seen anyone do it. We've seen people attempt to do it, and I think the person who's coming closest is in California, a guy named Fred Pilot. And it's well worth looking into his experiences if you go that way. The public-private partnership, we've seen a number of attempts in which cities have partnered in various ways with private companies, and in a number of them, it hasn't worked out nearly as well. Often because of the friction between the interests of a community, which wants to keep prices low and make sure everyone's served and do all these other things, and the difficulty of a private sector partner of doing that. Plus, you're taking already scarce funds from the revenues and you're splitting it now, so that makes the project more difficult. So, there's just a ton of risk all over these. What we tend to see is these communities that have done the best are those that have taken on the highest amount of risk, which is not surprising. There's a phrase, it's low risk, low reward, high risk, high reward. But what we often see, and what you might consider for your own model, is starting off with a low risk, if that's your tolerance, with a co-op model, for instance. And then if it doesn't work, you can fall back on a publicly owned model if need be. The danger of starting with low risk in a public-private partnership is that private partner can become an enemy of changing the status quo, even if the status quo is not working for the community. It's not to say they're bad people, but they have different interests. I hope I didn't stamp on any of the other panelists' toes there.
No, that's very helpful. Wally, any additional comments on this question of what is the risk with these models?
Well, there's always going to be risk, but one thing that we can do is look at the historical analogy of the rural electric and rural telephone cooperatives. When the 1936 Rural Electrification Act was written and passed, it provided subsidies for virtually any business model, for-profit, municipal, co-ops, nonprofits. I mean, they really, you look at the law and everything in kitchen sink is written in as eligible entities. But what came out of it, what survived and what succeeded, remarkably, were the nonprofit cooperatives that were locally controlled, locally accountable, and that directed the investments, directed the revenues back into the network, back into the community. So today, I think there's 500 or so rural telephone cooperatives, about 900 rural electric cooperatives. Most of them are getting into the broadband space, but the rural electric cooperatives aren't eligible for this $4.5 billion a year. And as I said earlier, nor are the municipal or other nonprofit community networks. So I think we need to get a movement going to raise awareness, both in Congress and in the general public, that this money is our money. It's the universal service fee we all pay $1, $2, $3 a month on our phone bills that has been allocated to solve these problems of rural build out, broadband build out in rural and other underserved areas. So there is revenue sitting there for broadband infrastructure expansion. We have to mount a political movement to make sure it's spent efficiently.
Okay, thank you. And Greta, any additional thoughts on this question of risk in these models?
Sure. So I want to add, I agree that the primary risks are probably, the risk of a loss on investment and the risk of falling behind in terms of social justice and equity. And of course, there's a risk that people won't make use of something that's been a huge investment. But I also want to return to the previous question about making sure that private partners will follow through on their obligations by returning to the model of Philadelphia, in which Earthlink, which Philadelphia spent a long time negotiating a number of public interest obligations with Earthlink. Earthlink, meanwhile, was making their business model muni wireless, muni broadband. And then Earthlink actually went under because that business model, it just wasn't working for them. So, another risk is that your private partner would not be able to kind of like create a sustainable or viable model itself. My recommendation would be to think about metrics, as Christopher and Joanne both pointed out. It's really important how you're evaluating these projects. So success is really relative. It's really about the goals that you set early on, and the way that the project is viewed in the long term has to do with what you're expecting going in and what comes out. So I would recommend setting up evaluation metrics and goals early on.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Are there any other audience members here in the room with questions at this time? I have one I particularly wanted to ask our panelists to weigh in on, each of them, and that is the issue of open access. We haven't talked about open access yet today. It's the idea that rather than one telephone or cable company owning the wire to your house and being the only provider that you can choose from, that instead some entity owns that wire and the wires down every street in your town, that multiple service providers can use to sell internet service to homes and businesses throughout the community. Open access broadband network where multiple providers are there for the community to choose from, and in general you could get more consumer choice and drive down cost and drive up speed and quality of service when consumers have choices. And that model is much more common in other countries than here in the United States. So I wanted our panelists, especially because this is one of our core values in this community, is open access, to each comment on how open access has worked in some of these different models. And so I'll one at a time let you each speak. First, Christopher, in the municipal broadband model and with community networks, how has open access been made to work? Are there some success stories and lessons that we can learn?
Right. I think you finished asking me. I'm sorry. So, I don't know. I'm getting in and out, but I'm going to assume that everything's well.
Yes.
And the open access in the municipal world has been a fairly clear record in terms of when you're actually connecting up homes and residents, businesses, and the last mile. It's been it's been a revenue suck. It's really failed to generate enough money to pay off the network if you're doing it all at once across the entire city. So examples of that are Utopia, iProvo, some of the public utility districts in Washington, which in addition to using this open access model also have a difficulty of being in very rugged mountainous terrain. But nonetheless, we don't have a lot of examples of open access working if you're trying to do it everywhere at once. Where we do see it working is in middle mile, where you are going in investment often with partners, but in middle mile, open access makes all the sense in the world because of the business model and economics are different. But it's also worked fairly well in places like Danville, Virginia, a couple of other networks in Virginia. I want to say Palm Beach County in Florida, a couple of other places that are smaller. And I think there's a lot of promise, and I think you're very smart to hold it as a value. Unfortunately, you're going to be blazing a new trail. But if to the extent that you're trying to do it on an incremental basis, that's the way it's worked the best for other municipalities. But I would study that, and I wouldn't really be shackled by it. I'd really try to learn the lessons from others, but recognize you're really trying something that's fairly new, and so you have to just do the best you can if you're going to go in that path, which I hope so, because quite honestly, it's the only way we're going to have real choices moving forward.
Thank you. Next, Joanne Hovis, tell us about open access and how we could achieve this, especially in public-private models.
Well, let me start by agreeing with Chris that, at least based on the relatively small data set we have, this is not an easy thing to accomplish from the standpoint of the financial metrics. Again, when you look at that broader set of metrics that have to do with the impact on the community, and if open access delivers competition and choice and innovation and differentiated services, then it presumably is a win. But on the financial statements, it appears to have been a very big challenge for the communities that did it. Although it's a sufficiently small sample size that I think it would be important to look at other factors and see if there are other things that work there as well. But there's sort of an emerging consensus among many of the people who do what we do that this is more challenging, and that if you're a single provider with a triple play, you are better positioned. As far as open access and the private-public partnership context, that appears to be the emerging model in Asia, where the Pacific Rim countries are almost all building with the financing and at the behest of or the direction of their central governments, fiber to the premises networks that are open access. And they're frequently public-private partnerships, at least partially funded by the central government, that would be the equivalent of our federal government, and frequently built, owned, and operated by the private sector, but with requirements around open access. That, however, takes subsidy, and that is what is happening in many of those countries, is that you have public subsidy because they're seeing fiber as a utility and as infrastructure and as critical to their economic futures rather than as the medium by which entertainment is delivered. That's a pretty important shift in thinking. Open access in the United States and public-private partnerships, I have to say the jury is out, and I would be irresponsible to say that it's going to go in one direction or another. We're just too early in this process. You would be blazing a new trail, and it would be an important one, and again would come down to what are the goals of your project and how do you define success. That might point to whether you went open access or not.
Okay, very good. And Wally, you're next, especially from this co-op and nonprofit lens. Tell us about how open access can work, and do you have any success stories?
If I heard correctly, the question is, how does open access work in a nonprofit or co-op model? As Christopher was saying, particularly with the middle mile, it's kind of a no-brainer. If you're in a rural area, you want to be open to all comers because it's a way to be sustainable. You need it. You need as many different clients, customers using the network to make it sustainable. With our nonprofit middle mile fiber here in the Asheville area, ERC Broadband, we even have the local cable company. Well, it's Charter, a national cable company, but it leases, it uses the network to supplement its own fiber network in the community. So that's at the middle mile, and I think that's where we have the most evidence for open access being integral to a successful business model. On the wireless side, it's there's just not enough deployment of wireless in the nonprofit world to really gauge for example, if someone wanted to use our wireless network, we'd be open to discussing that, and if the numbers work, fine. There's an interesting thing that I've seen very little comment on, and that is the broadband stimulus funding, the BTOP funding. These networks that got funding for broadband are required to operate on an open access model. Some of these are for-profit companies. So it'll be interesting to see once they build out and once they're operational, whether or not that open access stipulation is enforced.
Very good. And last, Greta Byram, tell us any additional thoughts on this question of how open access can work. Greta, are you still with us? We couldn't hear you.
Yeah. Me?
Now we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay. End of the question there, but I think that everybody else touched on a lot of what I would say. I would just add, I mean, I think if there's a policy issue that we're going to get excited about and try to gather some energy around, I think open access might just be, one of the most important ones. That, like Joanne said, you guys would be blazing a new path if you, if you establish a really vibrant open access network. And I would add that I think that it's a point of some leverage where you can sort of maintain a degree of control even within a public-private partnership if you do manage to hold on to the open access provision.
Thank you. And I think Joanne had one final comment on these open access questions.
Just a quick point to agree with my colleagues. On the BTOP stimulus-funded middle mile projects had these open access requirements, the interconnection and non-discrimination obligations. And in terms of the data that I'm seeing from the projects I've worked on, which are public and nonprofit projects, there really is an impact. I'm seeing projects in really rural areas where the middle mile has been put in. It's very low cost, and there are 3 providers making commitments to last mile build-outs because there is an open access, low-cost middle mile highway road into the distant neighborhood that they can then traverse so that they can put their money into the last mile. And I'm seeing this in multiple states. It's early days yet because most of the networks are not done with even their construction phase, but many of them are in preliminary negotiations. And over the next few years, we'll gather a whole lot more data based on this incredibly important experiment. To the credit of the government, we will have real data about, does open access in the middle mile work, and how extensively does it work, and what's the last mile outcome, and how does it impact underserved and unserved communities.
Very good. Thank you. Well, that is the last question we have time for today. I want to briefly say so many people have helped technically pull this off behind the scenes, and Danielle Chenoweth, especially at the Urbana-Champaign Independent Media Center, helped organize this and line up this outstanding panel. And to all our expert panelists on these topics, let's give a quick round of applause. On that note, I want to remind everyone the discussion will continue here locally. Of course, the Urbana-Champaign Big Broadband, or UC2B network, is examining these questions of how to expand. And even at next Monday night's 7 p.m. Urbana City Council meeting here at the same place on the same UPTV Channel 6, we'll be discussing some of our staff's findings on these and other topics. We'll be hearing the outcome eventually of the RFI that was conducted locally, and certainly making more decisions in the weeks and months to come. And nationally, I know this is a huge conversation for many communities. This recording will be archived online at ucimc.org, and we really appreciate all of the experts that came together and made this possible. So one final round of applause. Thank you. Good evening.